I know what she wanted to discuss was the experience of having done that and then the process of finding audiences for her history.
Hi again, everybody. I'm struck by how many of us seem to have some sort of personal contact in this, and I can't claim any contacts with the Hunter during my childhood. Sadly, I was born overseas and I'm an immigrant to this great land. But I've really taken to it since 1989. So the title of this session is The Place of Newcastle and the Hunter in History. So I took that as my starting point. And what I want to argue, just in a few minutes, is for the issues we've identified. So the things that have been troubling some of us as historians of Newcastle and the Hunter region. And I said historians again, and I'm looking out there at Kerry and thinking, Eric just mentioned boundaries, and I think one of the boundaries we need to probably let go of is talking about history as much as we have. I think we've started with a group primarily of historians because that's who we happen to be, but we really do want this to be about studies and more contemporary books at Newcastle Hunter as well. So some of the issues that we've identified are a low profile for studies of Newcastle and the Hunter in scholarly conversations taking place outside of this region. Secondly, difficulty in accessing funding, even from our own university, for topics related to this place. And thirdly, a simple equation of Newcastle in particular with a narrow range of topics, steelmaking, unionism, and coal mining. And here I think I'm probably going to diverge from Eric, and I think that's healthy that we have different views. But I think that those are things that are distinctive about this region, but I guess that is a debate that I'd like to have. Are we best off looking at what is distinctive or trying to see what we have in common with other places? But starting from those three sort of issues or problems that some of us have identified, I don't think it's the place of our region in the past that is the problem, because we all know that Newcastle was an important centre for comics where perhaps really quite innovative and exciting things were happening. We know that the Hunter made a great contribution to agriculture, viticulture, the establishment of the wool industry. So the place of Newcastle in the past is not a problem. But it's its place in the present that I would argue is what's causing us these difficulties. So am I talking in riddles? I hope not. Late last century, as Julie just mentioned, I wrote a PhD thesis on Newcastle, which I called Creating the Coalopolis, Perceptions of Newcastle, 1770 to 1935. I'd only been in the country a few years when I started it, and I was struck by the contrast between what friends and associates in Sydney thought of Newcastle, you know what they thought, dirty, run-down, slightly dangerous, definitely not a place that you would ever go to test any of these preconceptions that you had about it. And what I had experienced and observed here myself, friendly, attractive, wonderful beaches, good things. I thought there must be a genealogy of these ideas, because they weren't personal ideas these people had come up with themselves, they were received views. And so I thought, as a historian who vowed to study the place in which I found myself, that this was a really interesting and valuable study to make. I could identify how a veil of assumption and stereotype had developed over 200 years, that it created a very narrow and generally negative view of Newcastle abroad, which was not warranted, and which tended to make people assume that Newcastle had little to offer to them in the present, and that it was irrelevant to the national past. So in a copy postgraduate kind of way, I thought I could start a reassessment of the city in general, or at least in my own discipline of history. So I tried. I gave lots of conference papers, published a scholarly article in a major journal based on my thesis, but I couldn't find a publisher for the whole thesis. And that's not unusual. A lot of PhDs never become books, but I always did kind of wonder, you know, I've gotten through without needing to make revisions 20 years on, I think it is well and truly time for another go. History has been on my side. So BHP closed 4 years after my thesis was completed, taking with it part of the rationale for the stereotype of Newcastle. The university has grown and makes a bigger impact on the city now. The boom in residential construction has drawn outside investors to the inner city. The leisure cultures based around art, coffee, and consumption have brought a new appreciation of Newcastle's waterfront and the fortunate few older buildings which have been revitalized. Even the editors of The Lonely Planet joined in to try to persuade people around the world that Newcastle was a great city to visit. So I'm hoping that along with some of these stereotypes of race and sexual orientation that we have been able to move away from, perhaps we can start to move away from stereotypes of place as well. And that now, if we go out to the marketplace of ideas with something substantive to say about Newcastle past and present, there will be an attentive audience. Beyond this, I hope that those who hear or read our work, whether in the Hunter region, elsewhere in Australia, or in a region maybe with some commonalities to our own in other countries, they might find something in it for themselves, something applicable to their own interests, something which might motivate them to consider evidence from Newcastle the next time they're researching the contemporary use of social media, or the lives of convicts, or the meaning of music in the Victorian era. In 1995, when I submitted my PhD, this felt like a rather solitary endeavour. But this time around, surrounded by allies,